Hi, and welcome back to Critical Thinking. Last class we were talking about cognitive bias. Today we're going to change gears and we're going to talk about rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion. As we do critical thinking, very often it's important to distinguish proof and persuasion, especially when we get into talking about logic and argumentation, because we could define logic as a means, well, not necessarily a definition of logic, but we could talk about logic as a means of trying to persuade somebody as to the truth of a claim. Okay, but the type of proof, or rather persuasion, that we're talking about when we come to an argument is usually a rational type of persuasion. Okay, so that means there are different types of persuasion. And rhetoric is an art and a skill that is designed to try to persuade you using different techniques, and it's not always a matter of logic and reason. There are other things that are involved. So let's go ahead and take a look at the art of persuasion. I started the PowerPoint with just a little cartoon that I came across. It's an example of what we might call rhetorical device. Counselor kindly referred to it as murder, not thinning out the herd. You may not get the joke yet, but you will by the end of the presentation, because we're going to be talking about different rhetorical devices. So this first section is going to cover clarity, credibility, and rhetoric. What do we mean first by clarity? Clarity has to do with the ability to communicate meaning. When we are clear in our communication, then we get our meaning across to our audience, and whether it's in writing, written form, or spoken form. So clarity at the level of meaning is most often threatened by vagueness and ambiguity. So the things that you want to avoid in communicating a message are vague and ambiguous terminology, or a vague and ambiguous construction of sentences. There are different forms of vagueness and ambiguity, so we're going to look at a few types. So there are four main causes of confusion: vagueness, ambiguity, generality, and undefined terms. So let's walk through each of these, starting with just the idea of vagueness itself. We'll say a claim is vague when its meaning is excessively inexact. Intrinsically, vague words don't have borders around them. Right? They're a little bit fuzzy. The edges are a little bit hazy. Something can mean something maybe more than you intended it to, right? You might cross over into a different definitional area. So when we use words like bald, rich, fast, heap, they have some quantitative significance, but they're not precisely defined, right, or delimited. So when I say someone's bald, you might have a picture in mind, but you don't know exactly what you should be picturing, right? Because there are different levels of baldness. I mean, is he completely bald? Is he missing most of his hair? If somebody's rich, what exactly does that mean? It tends to mean he has more money than other people that you would consider not rich, but we don't know exactly what that means, because you've got, Bill Gates rich, and then you've got somebody less than Bill Gates. I was going to say Donald Trump, but I wanted to avoid him. To be successful, you must do a good job. That's a pretty vague statement. We don't know what successful exactly means. We don't know what exactly a good job is. So a lot of times we need to choose some better language, to choose some better terms to try to make that more precise or exact. Okay, so some general rules that we can follow would be these. Some level of vagueness, generally acceptable, expected, it's normal. I mean, we tend to talk in a particular way. Of course, if you're trying to communicate a meaning to an audience, then you want to try to refine things, okay? It's not always useful to have your common ordinary discussion if you're trying to communicate clearly, right? As a general rule, we could say if a claim is not too vague to convey appropriately useful information, then the level of vagueness is acceptable. If the vagueness makes it difficult or impossible to assess a claim, then it's not acceptable. The next term is ambiguity. So what I mean by an ambiguous statement, we'd say a claim is ambiguous if it could have more than one meaning without clues from the context about which meaning to assign. It's fine if a word has more than one meaning. We often get the exact meaning of a word from its context. So if I was just going to throw out the word bat, B-A-T, and say, picture a bat in your head, you don't know exactly what to think about, because that's a type of word that has more than one possible meaning. For instance, you might be picturing a baseball bat. You might be picturing a winged mammal. The context would give you more information so that it would reduce the ambiguity. So if I was to say the person picked up the bat in order to swing at the ball, then I think you would have an appropriately useful understanding. It would be, therefore, acceptable. Moving further forward, 3 types of ambiguity can be distinguished. One is what we call semantic ambiguity. One is syntactic ambiguity, and one we'll just call the grouping ambiguity. So let's see what the differences are between them. First, intentional versus unintentional ambiguity. A claim could be ambiguous due to an accident on the part of the writer or speaker. It could be intentional on their part. So an intentional ambiguity might be used to purposely mislead somebody, or might be necessary because of the context. So there may be times when I'm actually trying to be vague. Like if I want to respond to somebody in a way that doesn't necessarily offend them, I could maybe phrase my response in an ambiguous way where they could take it as in a positive and not necessarily as a negative. If I have some kind of unintentional ambiguity, we should try to usually avoid that. If we realize that we're being ambiguous, you can go back and clarify things. And that can be avoided usually just with care and patience. So understanding the difference between the 3 types of ambiguity can help you identify ambiguity in what others are writing, help you avoid adding unintentional ambiguity in your own work, and that's really important too. So you want to be able to distinguish it on both sides, as a speaker and as a audience. So first, semantic ambiguity. We also call this equivocation. This is when a word can be used in more than one way. The word has multiple meanings. So for example, our mothers bore us. The word bore can be understood in more than one way. I mean, are our mothers so dull that they're putting us to sleep? Or are we talking about the fact that our mothers gave us birth? So the word bore right there could probably pick a better term to communicate it, or give more context so that the audience knows what's being stated. So that would be an example of equivocation. And sometimes ambiguity leads to some interesting humor. If you're familiar with some very famous comedy routines, a lot of comedy routines and jokes and stuff rely on ambiguity. A famous one that comes to mind all the time when I teach this course is the famous Abbott and Costello routine, Who's on First, where they're using particular words that could mean one thing, or he's using them in the context of a nickname. I'm not going to go through the skit. I would really butcher it, and I'm not going to show you guys the clip. But if you had a chance, look up Abbott and Costello Who's on First routine, and you're going to see a great example of semantic ambiguity in action. Next, we have syntactic ambiguity. This is also called amphibology. When we get to informal fallacies later on, we're going to talk about some of these types of things, specifically amphibology. Now, when the meaning is ambiguous due to its grammatical construction, so here you're going to need an entire claim or sentence in order to commit some kind of syntactical ambiguity, for example. And this is another very famous and old joke. This morning, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I'll never know. That's the punchline. If you weren't familiar, I think that's a Marx Brothers joke. Groucho Marx, probably a little earlier than Abbott and Costello, to come to think of it, but who's wearing the pajamas is not really clear by the way the sentence is constructed. If you were to say, this morning I shot an elephant while I was wearing my pajamas, then it's pretty clear what's going on. But phrased as it is, it's ambiguous. So we're talking about syntactic problems, meaning we could arrange the sentence in a way to avoid this kind of ambiguity. It's word order that comes into play in grammar. So if you are poor in your grammar skills, then you're more likely to commit some kind of syntactical ambiguity. Of course, if you're really skilled in grammar, you might be able to masterfully create a syntactically ambiguous statement on purpose if you're trying to be intentional. Grouping. What we mean by grouping is related to a fallacy we'll study later called the composition fallacy. And ambiguity of this sort results from confusion of whether a term is used collectively or distributively. When we say a term is used distributively, we mean that it's applying to a member of a group, the part of a whole, and not to the whole group, whereas a collective use of a term applies to the group in its entirety. So I'll give you an example, and this might make this more clear. When I say Americans are willing to drop nuclear weapons, the question is about the word Americans. Are we talking about there being individual members of the group we call Americans? There are certain Americans that are willing to drop nuclear weapons? Or are we talking about Americans as a country, as a nation? That's a different thing, okay? And there'd be a different truth value to that claim, based on individuals. If you're talking about individuals, I'm sure there are individuals that are willing to do all kinds of horrible things. As a nation, it's more likely that that statement would be false. because the fact is most Americans don't want anything to do with nuclear warfare. So there's an example of grouping fallacy. There's also another ambiguity here, the word drop. What do we mean by drop, right? So that's a semantic ambiguity. Do we mean actually drop the bomb? Okay, that's the way I interpret it when I was first talking about composition fallacy. But it could also mean drop the topic, right? Kind of lay it aside and not deal with it. So you could fix it in various ways just to make it more clear. Perhaps we want to say the American people are willing to utilize nuclear weapons. That's pretty clear, I think, sufficiently clear and acceptable. What do some of these statements mean? I'm not going to actually unpack these, but I wanted to give you some other examples of ambiguity. Some of these might actually be humorous, and I took these from various newspaper headings and things like that. It's always fun to look at newspaper headings because newspapers, the headings are usually done in such a way that are really open to ambiguity very often, which makes them really funny to look at. Fine for littering. Technically, this one is not necessarily from a newspaper. You could picture it on a sign posted somewhere to let somebody know, maybe the result of littering. As we usually would interpret this as, you're going to get a fine if you litter here. Of course, it could also mean you're perfectly free to litter as you please. You get the joke. Arson suspect is held in Massachusetts fire. I probably won't pause after every one of them, but think about it for a second and you'll see, hopefully, both ways you could read it. Blind bishop appointed to see. That might be a little bit more difficult if you don't know what the see is, as far as Catholic offices. Body search reveals 4,000 in crack. British left waffles on Falkland Islands. Deaf college opens doors to hearing. Farmer Bill dies in house. Fund set up for beating victims' kin. Kids make nutritious snacks. Never withhold herpes infection from loved one. Prostitutes appeal to Pope. As you can see, all of these are jokes, and some of them could be hopefully not too offensive, but you get the picture. Moving on from there to generality. Generality is a characteristic of being too broad and not providing enough information. Generality is related to both vagueness and ambiguity. The less detail a claim has, the more general we say it is. A term that's too general picks out too many objects. The addition of further information, of course, can reduce generality, make things a little bit more precise and specific. So, here's our example. The advertisement read, "No animals allowed," so the apartment remains vacant to this day. Now, no animals allowed is being interpreted as a pretty general statement, and the joke in this little claim is that apartment is vacant because, human beings are animals too. Of course, it's only a joke. Most people wouldn't fall for that. We could say if there's a sign that says no animals allowed, I would think it's sufficiently clear to communicate the meaning that's intended, but there might be a loophole here. A lot of times, if you're not precise, speaking of loopholes, we think of, court cases where you've got laws that are on the books. Sometimes it's interesting the way somebody might interpret a law to try to find a way around particular things. Those are the kind of cases where you want to be as precise as possible when you're laying down legislation. Of course, sometimes it could be intentionally vague. Perhaps the lawmakers want it to be vague enough so that you can interpret it a little bit more broadly and apply it to different types of situations. So maybe I spoke a little too soon. Anyways, the joke in this is actually a play on the term animal, like I said. So let's talk now about how to avoid ambiguity, vagueness, generality through the use of definition. So let's talk about how we can define terms and different ways that we can define terms. One way to avoid vagueness and ambiguity is by defining terms. 4 purposes for definition. Number 1, to tell us what a word means. Second, to assign meaning in a particular context. Third, to reduce vagueness, generality, or ambiguity. And the fourth is to persuade. There are specific types of definitions designed for that reason. We'll see what they are in a second. So let's first talk about the types of definitions that are relative to purpose. A lexical definition is one that simply tells us the ordinary meaning of a word. This we could say is our dictionary definition. You've got an explanatory definition, which illustrates the implications of an already known but difficult concept. And I'll give you examples for some of these. Every use of the word beauty implies some suitability to a purpose. Okay, that's one way to try to explain beauty as you're defining beauty. suitability to a purpose is not necessarily a lexical definition or a dictionary definition, but it does add something to that definition, explanatory value. Next, we have the stipulative definition, which assigns a meaning. In other words, it's picking a meaning for a particular context. For example, we will call those data that help predict the economy's future leading indicators. In other words, that's how we're going to be using the term. And you'll often find this in many classes that you might take. Instructors will do this. I do this myself. In certain classes, I'll say, well, in this class, we're going to use the word legend in this particular way. I think I just did that in my mythology class just the other day. Okay, so we can stipulate definitions so that our audience will know how we are going to be using it specifically. Might not be the normal way that it's used, but we're free to do this. We're still clear when we do this as long as we lay down the boundaries of the definition up front so that there's no confusion with the audience we're speaking to. The next would be a precising definition. This type of definition will narrow down the meaning of an unclear term to reduce ambiguity, right? We make it more precise. So, for example, by walking, we specifically mean moving under one's own power while keeping at least 1 foot on the ground. That's going to make it more precise. This might be useful with, children in school who you see, breaking the school rules by running in the halls, right? Running usually involves feet coming off the floor, even slightly, whereas walking generally does not. So we might want to be a little bit clear what we mean by walking. Next is the rhetorical definition. This is where we're trying to persuade. And this is not necessarily a real definition at all. We can call it a pseudo-definition because we're trying to work on somebody's feelings, right, and influence another person's opinions, perhaps. So here's an example of a rhetorical definition. It's also called the connotative meaning, right? When we say a connotative versus a denotative, we would say the denotative meaning might be closer to the lexical definition. A connotative meaning, we mean it's a meaning based on a person's experience, right? It will bring along with it certain emotional associations and stuff like that. So here's the example. That word casualties refers to our sons and daughters killed in battle, right? It's trying to bring about kind of a vivid idea of what we mean by talking about casualties, right? Kind of the type of definition that's going to influence you to think twice about backing a motion to go to war with another country or something like that. Okay, so that would be called rhetorical definition, and it's a type of persuasive device, obviously. General kinds of definitions relative to the manner. Let's take a look at some of these. Analytical. An analytical definition. This is going to specify the features that a thing has to possess in order for the term to apply to it. Again, here's the denotative meaning. This, like I said, is closer to the lexical meaning. It's the meaning that expresses the attributes or properties that an object has. So if I was going to try to describe a dog, I would add certain characteristics to try to get at what exactly I'm speaking about. Four-legged mammal kind of gets us there. It doesn't quite capture everything because it's a little too broad. It could apply to a cat just as equally as it could to a dog. But again, we're specifying certain features that the thing often has. It's an analytical situation. The whole idea of conceptual analysis relies on distinguishing sufficient and necessary conditions in order to specify more clearly terms and their exact referent. Okay, next we have the definition by example, or the ostensive definition. This is merely pointing at something, right? Naming something, identifying an example, right? So instead of saying dog's four-legged mammal, I might say dog, and I point over there at Scooby-Doo. Okay, that's what I mean by dog. I'm pointing or giving an example. It doesn't really tell you what it is we're talking about. It's not analytical in any way, but it's helpful. And that's usually how you start to learn a language. A lot of good approaches to language learning, for instance, are going to use pictures and visuals. It's kind of how we naturally learn a language as a child. We'll be told, this is an apple, and you kind of point to it, and the child will start to identify the object with the thing, and only later do they develop the ability to try to analyze what it is we're talking about as an apple, that it's a fruit, that it grows on trees, that it has this or that characteristic, and so on, okay? We also have definition by synonym, where we just give a different word that usually is interchangeable. So instead of saying dog, I could use the word canine. It might not be as common, but it's still perfectly acceptable, and most people are going to understand it. I just want to give you a few tips for writing argumentative essays, because in a class like this, you will probably be asked to write some responses, reflection papers, essays, and such, perhaps even arguments later on that are specifically structured as arguments. And I know in various other courses throughout your college career, you're going to be doing the same type of thing. So here's just some basic tips that I think are worth sharing, and they're very general as well. Steps and components of good argumentative essays. First of all, you want to state the issue. And last time, I believe it was last lecture, or perhaps the one before that, we talked a little bit about what an issue is. So if you recall, an issue is where we can raise a question as to whether or not such and such is true. Okay, so you want to state the issue up front. You're going to state your position on the issue. Then you want to work by giving support for that position. It's not just a matter to make claims and assertions about it. You want to give supporting claims that are going to help you hopefully persuade somebody as to your opinion. And you also want to, in some way, refute contrary positions or predict responses that you might face that opponents might present to try to undercut your position and deal with those. And the more authentic and realistic those contrary positions are presented, and the more you actually tackle those things in a realistic way, the stronger your case is actually going to be. It's one thing to raise your position and support your position and then give, kind of weak objections to it. Those are easy to respond to, and the weaker the objection, the less convincing your argument is ultimately going to be. You want to give the best possible objection to your point of view, and if you could deal with that, then your point of view is going to come across as that much stronger. For example, I'm going to give you the method that Thomas Aquinas used. He was a philosopher from the Middle Ages and one of the greatest philosophers in the Aristotelian tradition. And if you ever read any of his work, and I'm going to assume that most of you won't, he had a very specific way of arguing, very rigorous and orderly. His chosen procedure was this. He would put certain questions out that were under consideration. He would give you the issue. Then he would cite objections right up front, contrary positions, and those that would be presented very often by other philosophers. Then he would give a short rebuttal based on citations from certain authorities he thought were competent authorities, responding again to those objections. And then he would present the body of his argument, right? The reasons for his position. And this would be the meat of the matter, right? Pretty lengthy defense of his position. And then at the end, he would then reply to each of the initial objectives in a detailed way from his own argumentation. Okay, it's a very thorough way of doing it. And I give you an example, just a link here in the PowerPoint. You can copy this down since you probably won't be able to hit the screen that you're watching, but this is from Summa Theologica, question 90. Just an example from the Sacred Text website, which has a lot of his material for free, easily accessible wherever you are. Okay, moving forward. Judging the credibility of a claim. There are a few things we need to consider when we're trying to judge a claim that's presented to us. Two basic grounds for suspicion. First of all, the claim itself needs to be evaluated, and also the source of that claim. Let's start by assessing the claim. How do we decide whether or not to believe a claim? So even if there aren't any arguments provided for the claim, it's generally reasonable to accept a claim if it doesn't conflict, first of all, with our background information, and if it comes from a reliable source. So that's going to deal with the claim itself and the source of the claim. So we're talking about what we might call initial plausibility, kind of how credible it seems on the surface when we're first presented with it. So it's a measure of how well the claim squares with the background information, direct observation, and so on, because we've got both of those things to play with. Number one, let's take a look at an example, and we'll unpack what we mean by background information and direct experience. Direct experience is actually part of our background information if you think about it. This claim, which I took from one of the textbooks, says, your kids will grow faster if they have 2 ginseng supplements each day. All right, there's a claim that we would immediately respond to by belief or non-belief, based purely on its initial plausibility. So to assess that, we want to measure it against observations that we have, background information that we presented with that might have to do with children, growth rates, supplement information, scientific facts and such. And how plausible is that claim? Well, it doesn't seem to be that plausible because we tend to observe that children grow at a pretty uniform rate across the board. Some people might grow a little bit quicker than others, but you are not going to see children usually shoot up through, diet alone. So it tends to have, I would say, a low initial plausibility. Another claim, vomiting is your body's way of getting rid of something harmful. Now, if we think about this one, on the surface, it might appear a little bit more plausible. We do know about food poisoning. We have seen things like that. You may have even gotten sick yourself by eating something that was spoiled or rotten and had the unfortunate response of vomiting later that evening, maybe even getting, a little bit of a fever and other agony along with it. But we don't always vomit just from, poisonous substances and bad foods. Sometimes we vomit due to motion sickness. Perhaps you get off of a roller coaster and you find yourself nauseous and vomit. So those types of things happen as well. Morning sickness, when somebody's pregnant, very often they'll go through this phenomenon of morning sickness. It doesn't mean that there's something harmful that they've ingested. That's your background information with claim 2. Let's look at another claim. All right, your gas gauge says E. You have 2 gallons left in the tank. If you're an experienced driver and actually drive your car until the gas light comes on, and sometimes I am very thankful that the manufacturers of automobiles put in a gas light that tells you when you're on empty to draw your attention to it, you'll probably notice that you can still drive a little while that light is on. Of course, in the past, I didn't used to have those lights. I remember back when I was in high school riding around with my cousin in his Jeep. I think several times we just totally ran out of gas because we weren't paying attention to the little gas gauge. There wasn't the warning light the way there is today. But generally, we know from experience that when the light comes on and the gauge is on empty, you still have enough fuel to go a certain number of miles. Sometimes the cars actually have a little meter that'll tell you still can get about 30 more miles on what's left in the tank. So yeah, that would have a higher level of initial plausibility, again, based on our background information and based on our experience. So we'd say it's strong initial plausibility. When it comes to assessing the source, we want to see, where that information is coming from, right? Is this a person who has credibility? And there are different types of things we would base that opinion on. So we would say their credibility could be based on factors like the individual's knowledge, the truthfulness or reputation for truthfulness that the person has, the accuracy that the person usually has, and the objectivity of the person. Okay, so knowledge, truthfulness, accuracy, and objectivity. One thing we want to question is whether or not the party is an interested party. That could bring up red flags. This would be something related to what we talked about last time with bias. Is the person biased in the issue? Okay, and are going to present certain things to persuade you as to their perspective. Bias is something to be aware of, but it's not something that's necessarily going to force you into rejecting a claim, hopefully. A person who stands to gain from a belief, we'd say, is an interested party. If there's some benefit that they can get. A person with nothing at stake, in our belief, we'll call a disinterested party. So the interested party should be viewed with a little bit more suspicion, naturally, right? The question of truthfulness comes to play. If they have something to gain by telling a lie, we could be suspicious as to whether or not they are telling the truth. Same thing with objectivity. So going back to the idea of knowledge, let's say expertise is relevant, right? Knowledge makes a person a little bit more credible. Thus, expert knowledge makes somebody the most credible of sources. Of course, it doesn't mean, and again, we always have to clarify and qualify these things, because it doesn't mean that an expert in a field can't be wrong, or that you shouldn't question what experts say, because very often there are other experts that might have contrary opinions, different information. Lots of fields, there are disagreements among the experts, debates among the experts, and it's always wise not to just take something at face value based on expert opinion. There's a fallacy we'll study later called the appeal to authority, and that's where this becomes relevant. But in general, I'm saying expert knowledge should be taken over an amateur's knowledge, okay, in general. Experts have the education, the training, the experience to possess certain knowledge on a subject that other people generally don't have. Therefore, they're more believable. Now, whether or not a matter concerns direct observation, the expert's claims should be accepted over the non-experts. If it's something that has to do with direct observation, then if you are capable of having the same observation as the expert, then you don't need to rely on the expert. You can rely on the direct observation is the idea. Some general rules are going to be these. It's reasonable to be suspicious of a source if a claim either lacks credibility inherently or comes from a source that lacks credibility. Rhetoric and persuasion. The art of persuasion, according to Aristotle, is defined this way. This is actually a quote from his Rhetoric 1.2, and I'm just going to read the highlighted portions. He says, "The faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. The power of observing the means of persuasion on almost any subject." So here he's tying it into persuasion. The art of persuasion is what, like I said, we defined it before. And Aristotle actually talks about different modes of persuasion, which is what I was hitting at in the beginning. There's the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. So when I was talking about persuading you through reason, that would be the logos aspect of rhetoric. But I said rhetoric goes beyond just that. We could talk about the ethos, pathos, and logos, so let's talk about what we mean by the influence of character, the emotional appeal, and the use of reasoning. Very briefly, here's another quote from Aristotle from the same passage in the Rhetoric. And I'll again just read the highlighted portions. Of the modes of persuasion, there are three kinds. First kind depends on the personal character of the speaker, the second on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, and the third on proof. Going down, when we stir the emotions, we provide a truth and persuasive arguments. Character, that's the first one. People that have a certain reputation are going to generally be more persuasive than people that have suspicious reputation. Somebody that is very dignified is often viewed as somebody more trustworthy, and we can believe what they say. Again, that's not always the case. And then putting the audience in a certain frame of mind would have to be how you phrase your words or craft your speech. What kind of emotions are you trying to elicit as you speak to move the audience in a way that's not relying purely on the argument or reasoning involved. And then when he talks about proof, that's where we're talking about the reason, the premises for an argument, the supporting claims that are going to hopefully persuade as to the truth of the matter. Okay, so the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. Logic versus rhetoric. Again, that's exactly what we've been talking about, and we're going to study logic more formally later in the semester, but logic and rhetoric have been the twin anchors in Western education since the days of Aristotle. Those used to be standard courses of study. As a matter of fact, logic used to be taught in middle schools. It's usually not even taught in high schools at this point, and even in college you can sometimes get through without taking a course in logic, though I wouldn't recommend it. Logic is used to demonstrate the truth of a claim in order to prove something, whereas rhetoric, we already said, is used to win somebody to your point of view or persuade them. Remember, proof and persuasion are not the same things. Rhetoric is psychologically effective, but doesn't necessarily establish anything for sure. Rhetoric doesn't prove, it persuades, whereas logic is supposed to give you not psychological reasons, but logical reasons. It's kind of redundant to say that. So rhetoric gives psychological reasons. When I use the word there, I'm using the word reason sort of loosely. Argument, or deductive argument, of course, tries to prove. However, it might fail to persuade. I can present you with a really valid, even a sound, logical, deductive argument that proves exactly what I want it to prove, but you can come away unpersuaded if you don't follow the argument. That's very often the case. Of course, if it is an argument that truly proves its conclusion, and you're a rational, reasonable person who understands the argument, then you should be persuaded by it and would be foolish to reject the conclusion after that. So we'll call that a logical reason. So we'll distinguish between psychological reasons and logical reasons for believing something. Critical thinkers have to distinguish the two. Argument from rhetoric, or the logical from the psychological. It's important to recognize the use of non-argumentative persuasion so a fair assessment of a claim can be made. Very briefly, I'll just include the 5 canons of rhetoric. I don't want to test you guys on this, but just so you know, the guide to composing a persuasive message, in addition to the tips that I gave you before, would be invention, right, the process of developing your arguments, then arranging or organizing the argument for its best effect, coming up with a style so that you can present the argument in a certain way, the memorization of the argument or speech that's going to help you present it in a more effective way, and then the delivery, even involving body language if this is delivered in front of an audience, right? The way you pronounce your words, the tone, the pace of your presentation, all has an effect on the rhetorical power of the case that you're trying to make. We could also talk about rhetorical devices. There are different tests for assessing information. Rhetorical devices are methods for using emotionally loaded language, claims that attempt to persuade us in some way. So they attempt to influence our beliefs, thoughts, attitudes, feelings, and behaviors and actions. So let's just look at a few of these. Words or expressions often carry emotive meaning. We already said this is what we mean by rhetorical force, the power to elicit a psychological and emotional response from a hearer. And I'm going to go through a few rhetorical devices: euphemisms and dysphemisms, Weaslers, downplayers, stereotypes, innuendo, loaded questions, ridicule, sarcasm, hyperbole, rhetorical definitions, explanations, rhetorical analogies and comparisons, and proof surrogates, as well as repetition. And we can group these into different categories as well. The first group we'll call the slanters. Okay, there are different tasks that some of these might have. So one, to make things sound better than they are, to make things sound worse than they are, to avoid criticism, or to make something more or less important. So this is where euphemisms are going to fall in. We could replace one expression with another that carries respectively more positive or negative associations. So I'll give you a few examples, but I won't slow down very much here. Escort, that could be a euphemism for a bodyguard. Okay, it could also be a euphemism for a prostitute. You could also have a dysphemism for a bodyguard, which would be like calling them a thug. All right, one sounds more positive, one sounds more negative. That's what we mean by euphemism and dysphemism. A Weasler would be a way of kind of qualifying things in order to avoid criticism or to get out of something, right, to shield a claim. So an example of that might be using the word perhaps or possibly when you make a claim. As far as I know, or within reasonable limits. Okay, so you've got a way out. If you say, as far as I know, blah, 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 if it turns out that that's false, you've at least said, as far as I know. You have a downplayer. It's a rhetorical device used to make something seem less important than it actually is. You could attach a thing like the word merely or mere or so-called, right? This so-called expert on climate change. I think that's the example I gave you. No. All right, Bill borrowed his father's credit card. Put words in scare quotes like that is also going to, downplay something. So it's, he didn't steal it, he simply borrowed it. Then you get the second group where you rely on unwarranted assumptions. An assumption is an idea that you hold to as background information. It's usually not stated overtly, but the issue does rest a little bit on the assumptions that we have hidden in the background. And all reasoning does require assumptions. That phrase that, happens when you assume, I'm not going to go on with the phrase, but the fact is you have to make assumptions in order to reason at all. The problem is sometimes our assumptions are unwarranted or are poor assumptions, and we need to try to point out or figure out where we are relying on an unjustified or false assumption. We don't want questionable assumptions because they can undercut the argument. So stereotypes would fall under this category. Stereotypes a generalization or an assumption about all the members of a group based on some image that is circulating about that group, right? Stereotypes are often negative. They're not always that way. Sometimes they're positive. Here's an example, like Asians are smart, women are irrational, religious people are bigots. Asians are smart might be fairly positive, the other one's pretty negative. But again, these are stereotypes. These are overgeneralizations. And again, they are basically false when they really apply to individuals. Innuendo is where we apply something without saying it overtly. A great example would be, far be it from me to call my opponents liars, right? So I'm not calling them a liar, but just the fact that I mention it in that way, again called significant mention, already gets you thinking of my opponent in that manner, that you're considering that they are a liar, even though I didn't accuse them of that officially. Loaded questions. This is where the answer to a question that you phrase a question rather in such a way that whatever answer you give is going to respond to some other assumption built into the question. So no matter how it's answered, the assumption is being asserted. A famous example here is, have you stopped beating your wife? Right? That's a loaded question. We're going to look at more of those later in the semester. If you say no, if you say yes, it really doesn't matter because you've already admitted that you're beating your wife or have been beating your wife in the past. A third group would be the slanters. These use humor and exaggeration to try to move the audience. And these are really, really effective, but they really don't have any use in actually making a proof. So let me give you some examples of types, like the use of ridicule, the horse laugh, or sarcasm, which is basically the idea of just laughing at your opponent's position, mocking it, using ridicule. If you ever watch good debates, or at least persuasive debates, a lot of good debaters, by the way, will use laughter when they're presented with something that they don't know how to respond to with an argument. They'll just mock it and say that idea is so foolish, it's not worth responding to. That's a type of ridicule. Hyperbole would be exaggeration, where we're using exaggeration, again, for its emotional effect. Again, these are all about moving the emotions, right? Describing conservatives as fascists, that's hyperbole. It's also a dysphemism. Describing liberals as communists, same type of thing. Using exaggeration, it brings with it certain emotional responses. She's dumber than a rock, okay? Not literally, but again, this is hyperbole, ridicule, comparison as well. And then you've got definition by comparison, which is ordered, again, to influence somebody, mislead the audience perhaps. Going on to some examples, explanations and comparisons are very effective at doing this. So we can talk about rhetorical definition and rhetorical explanation, where we use loaded language to try to, and we already talked about this earlier, so I don't really need to go through this again right now, but the example, animals are our fellow conscious beings. That's supposed to, have more, or lead you to have more compassion on animals. Liberal is somebody who feels generous when they're giving away another person's money. Kind of a joke, but also rhetorical definition. And we can do the same thing when we make explanations, right? She smiled at you so she'd have an edge when you hand out raises. It makes you question as to, whether or not she's being sincere in her, reaction to you. Rhetorical language and misleading comparisons are out there. Rhetorical comparison and analogy. We'll talk a lot about analogy, specifically when we get to inductive reasoning and scientific reasoning later this semester. So I don't want to really unpack what we mean by analogy other than that it's a type of comparison, right? He had a laugh like an old car trying to start. That's what's called a simile. He's a fire plug. That's a metaphor. Those are types of comparisons. We use these again to elicit emotional responses. Now, when considering comparisons, we could ask several questions, and these are important to do. Number one, is important information missing? And is the same standard of comparison being used? Because if we don't have the same standard of comparison being used, there can be problems. We also have proof surrogates. These are things that stand in place of actual proof. Could be something as small as the attachment of an adverb into a sentence. So obviously tacked onto a sentence could be a proof surrogate. Okay, so I haven't actually given you the reasons. I'm just saying, obviously it's the case. So you assume that there are reasons, and it should be obvious to you. Okay, that is in place of proof. Phrases like reliable sources say, or everybody knows this, will stand in for proof as well. Also, the constant repetition of something is a rhetorical device that's going to get you to believe something. This is what's been used by masters of propaganda. When you hear something over and over and over again, you tend to believe that it's true. Okay, so if you could be bold and confident in your lies, perhaps you're going to be successful. Last thing I want to point out before we finish up is just how images are used in order to persuade. We will deal with this with our next lecture in more depth because we're going to be looking at advertising and advertising techniques. But I want you to be aware right now that images and pictures are never true or false. Okay, they are not claims. They're not propositions. They cannot be true or false, but they will elicit some kind of response. And they can be deceptive. And you have to remember, in today's day and age, images can be doctored very easily, digitally manipulated, and crafted so as to create in your mind a proposition that's false. So this picture here, Condoleezza Rice and Osama bin Laden. This is not Osama bin Laden. His face has actually been placed on the actual person in this photograph. But, if you know who those individuals are, who those individuals are supposed to be, you come away with a particular idea in mind. So this picture is not true, it's not false, but it can be emotionally persuasive. Okay, it could be an example of a rhetorical technique. Okay, that is unfortunately very much used and utilized in advertising. We are a visual group. We respond well to visual imagery. That is everything that I wanted to present. I apologize that I sped things up a little bit near the end, but I had to do that for a particular reason. Anyways, I'm glad you joined me. I'm going to see you guys in our next lecture, and that's going to be on advertising techniques. Take care.